All right, y'all. So a little bit of a change of plans. Originally wanted to cover this one in class, but looks like we're going to have to do this on video today. So let's get started with topic 4.3, the Columbian exchange. We're going to talk about, now that we've sort of talked about why states have been sponsoring expeditions and things like that, what happens once Columbus, right? The Portuguese, they explore Africa, the coast of Africa, they make a connection with Asia, etc. What happens when Christopher Columbus and then later on the rest of Europe connects with the Americas? So that's what we'll focus on here in this section. Now, your learning objective in this section is to explain the causes of the Columbian exchange and its effects on the Eastern and Western hemisphere. So this topic is really going to deal with the transfer of disease, of food, and people between Eastern and Western hemispheres. So again, remember, before 1492, the Europeans, the people in the Eastern hemisphere, Europe, Africa, Asia, etc., they know nothing about the people in the Americas. They know nothing of the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca. They know nothing about what's going on. So the theme for this section is one that we haven't really spent a ton of time in. It's humans and the environment. Um, and if we think back to our spice T chart, this is E for environment. And you can take a look. There's a lot of historical developments in there. There's a lot of key concepts here. So Columbian exchange is definitely an important topic, right? How do these new connections result in the exchange of plants, animals, diseases, etc.? European colonization is going to be a big one. Populations of Afro-Eurasia benefit from the increased diversity of crops. So lots of important topics to discuss out of this section. So we want to start off here with defining what we mean when we talk about the Columbian exchange. The Columbian exchange refers to the exchange of diseases, ideas, food, and people between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. The Eastern Hemisphere, again, is Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Western Hemisphere is North and South America. And this is all anything after 1492. You'll notice a lot of these topics are things that we've already talked about: cultural diffusion, technological diffusion, etc., and so on. Um, but in this context, we've talked about it in the exchange of like when the Asian empires interact with the Muslim empires, or when they interact with the African empires and whatnot. Here are two groups of people who know nothing of each other and are interacting for the first time. What happens when that takes place? So it's a little bit more, um, I hate to use the word dramatic, but it is a little bit more dramatic when you think about it. Now, again, before we really dive uh, into more detail about the Columbian exchange itself, we need to backtrack a little bit to understand how the European powers decide to divide up the New World. And if it's not something you've ever really thought about, if you think about South America, um, some people generally always wonder, like, why is Brazil the one country in South America that speaks Portuguese when the rest of South America, Latin America, Mexico speak Spanish? And that's really because of a treaty that was signed between Portugal and Spain in 1494 called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas has a long impact on the events that take place in the Americas. So it's really important that we really think about that before we look at any specific exchanges that take place. So when Columbus first comes back to Europe after his voyage, he stops in Portugal. He stops in Lisbon. He meets with King John II, and King John finds out that Columbus was sailing for Spain and claiming lands for Spain. And so this begins a conflict, a dispute between Portugal and Spain over any ownership of newly discovered lands. And again, think of the context. Before this, the Portuguese were the ones sailing out, claiming new islands, Madeira, the Azores, the Canary Islands, and so on, right? But now here's Spain, who's seemingly found some new islands or something out in the ocean. So there's a dispute, and the Treaty of Tordesillas is what kind of resolves that. They draw an imaginary line from the North Pole to the South Pole that divided what would be Spanish territory and what would be Portuguese territory. Land to the west of the line went to Spain, and land to the east of the line went to Portugal. So this is where Brazil comes to be a Portuguese speaking country, while the rest of South America is really dominated by the Spanish language. And I think Portugal gets the raw deal out of this treaty. They didn't know, right, how much land was out there. So where did they decide to put this line? How did they decide that this is where the line would go? They had no idea exactly how much land would be out there. So they get a little slice. They get Brazil, and Spain gets the rest. Now, this slide here is just some specific examples of colonized areas in the Americas. But again, remember here, it's not an exhaustive list, right? We can only fit so much on the slide. The colonized land exists far beyond the colonies that we list here. So in the upper left-hand corner, you have an image that really depicts the cruelty of the Spanish. It's an image, something called the Black Legend, and indigenous barbarity, including cannibalism. And it's an attempt to really justify the enslavement of the indigenous people in the Caribbean islands. So it's the way that the Spanish portray the natives. And again, we know about examples of cannibalism, of human sacrifice, and whatnot that exist in the Americas. We've talked about those with the Aztecs, the Maya. So the Spanish use that, depict the people that way, and say, we need to civilize these people. And we'll talk more about that as we go. The bottom left-hand side painting is a painting of a meeting between Cortes and Montezuma of the Aztec Empire. Cortes, as we learned in the last topic, would go on in a very short order and cripple and topple over the Aztec Empire. So that is the image that's depicted there. In the upper right-hand corner, you have the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. We talked about that with Henry Hudson. Uh, New Amsterdam would later go on to become New York City after the British claimed that from the Dutch in a bit of an exchange. New Amsterdam would go on to become New York, and then New York City, where you know it today. The middle picture on the right-hand side is a tobacco plantation in Virginia, where you have enslaved people processing the crop, the tobacco crop there. And again, the bottom right-hand photo or image shows the first meeting of the Portuguese and the natives of Brazil. Now, again, initially, Portugal wanted to really just set up some trading posts in the Americas, very similar to what they did in Africa, throughout the Middle East, and so on. But they do eventually come to really colonize Brazil and rule the territory as a full-fledged colony and as a full-fledged part of their empire, rather than just setting up a trading post. You could argue that makes it much more important, much more valuable. They saw a lot more value there, so they wanted to exploit that, and that's why they do it. But again, this just to show you some of the ways that this colonization is depicted in imagery. Now, for the most part, when we talk about disease, we're mostly going to speak about diseases that come from the old world to the new world. And again, the old world is Europe, Africa, and Asia, because that's the world we already knew. The Europeans already knew that. The new world is the Americas, because the Europeans have never known that world. Um, but there is documentation of at least one disease that made its way back from the New World to Europe, and that is syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, and it is thought that Christopher Columbus and his crew might have picked up the bacteria that causes syphilis from the Tainos in Hispaniola during his first voyage to the New World. How they acquired it, how they picked up that bacteria, I'll leave to imagination. But pictured here in the upper left-hand corner is a 15th century drawing of someone being treated for syphilis. Now, it's important that we stress here, this is the only disease that is thought to have come from the Americas and transferred to Europe. There's been debate about whether or not syphilis really existed in Europe before Christopher Columbus's voyage, but the most recent evidence that we have supports the claim that it did, in fact, come to Europe from Hispaniola from Christopher Columbus's first crew, not necessarily from Columbus himself. I want to point out, even though he does die from the disease later, but his crew is what picked up that bacteria from the New World. Again, how they picked it up, where it came from, you can we can only imagine. But like I said, for the most part, the diseases come from the old world to the new world. And that's not to say that diseases don't exist um, in the new world, that don't exist in the Aztec societies or whatnot. But they may be diseases that the Europeans had already been exposed to in other ways, or bacterias that had already. So these are things that maybe they weren't as affected by. The diseases that the Europeans bring, though, the Aztecs and the folks in the Americas, the indigenous people here who were living in the Americas, had absolutely, uh, zero protection from. So you're talking about things like smallpox, measles, the flu, right, the influenza virus, chickenpox, the plague, typhus, scarlet fever, pneumonia, and malaria. I've kind of lost count of how many diseases that is. I think that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 at least. Um, and again, it's lopsided. Europeans bring so much more disease to the Americas than ever went back. And so, as you can see, this transfer of disease is lopsided, and native populations in the Americas don't have any exposure to these diseases. They've never dealt with them before. They don't have any immunity. We don't have vaccinations really in this period of any scale. Um, so the effect that it has is significant. The indigenous population is significantly impacted, and we've talked about a few of these impacts already earlier when we talked about these communities in Unit 1. Now, again, it's hard to know exactly the precise numbers of people because, again, most of the records that are kept and that still exist to this period are European records. So it's a little bit challenging to always know exactly how many people died. But the effects of disease are significant, and it's virtually impossible to really calculate. And all we could do is pretty much best guess and estimate what the effects were. We talked about this when we talked about the Aztecs and the indigenous population in Mexico and the Maya and such. In some places, it's 80 to 90% of the native population throughout North and South America, particularly in Mexico, that are killed within a century of the arrival of the Europeans. Um, and that's not just disease, but the entire situation, the entire European contact. So European contact itself kills roughly 80 to 90% of the population. Half of that population is estimated to have died from disease alone. So for every 100 people, 50 people died from disease itself. The other 30 to 40% died from war, battles, etc., starvation, etc., whatever it may be. The deadliest disease by far was smallpox. And this event, what we call European contact, is to be considered the worst population disaster in recorded human history. Now, the map here shows the areas of known epidemics by 1600, but it's not necessarily showing you every area that was affected to some degree. And again, epidemic might be a word you're not familiar with. I know we've all sort of lived through a pandemic where that's really just a widespread, worldwide, global phenomenon of an epidemic that spreads worldwide. So an epidemic is an increase, often sudden, in the number of cases of a disease above what is normally expected in a population. So again, epidemic is here localized, right? You have an epidemic in Mexico and Latin America and South America. Pandemic, which you might be more familiar with, is just that on a global scale, if that makes more sense for you. Moving on to food here, most of the foods that come from the Americas have really gone on to become global staples since the Columbian Exchange. For example, the potato is eaten, right, consumed, and grown all over the world. And no South American country is even in the top 10 of potato production. In the US, Idaho is like the most famous for potatoes, but potatoes are everywhere. And in fact, Ireland, the country of Ireland, right next to England, up here in the northern part of Europe, Ireland is super well known for its potatoes and all of its potato foods and whatnot, foods that have potato. They love the potato. In fact, one period of time for them, they have something called the potato famine. Potatoes don't exist there before the 1490s, right? So it is the Columbian exchange that brings that potato to places like Ireland. Um, and South America is the only place that used to have potatoes. The Inca were the ones who grew the potato. Um, Tomatoes, something that's really associated with Italian food, right? You can't imagine pasta without tomato sauces or pizzas without tomato sauces and things like that. Even in Spanish cooking, in European Spanish cooking. But before the Columbian exchange, those don't exist in Europe. Period. There's no tomatoes at all in Europe. They don't know what the tomato is. They come from Peru as well. So just think of this: you have tobacco, vanilla, right? Vanilla is so popular all around the world, and today is really heavily grown in Africa, a lot of places. But you have tomatoes, you have peppers, beans, beans, um, cacao, chocolate, the things that that are used to make chocolate, maize, corn, potatoes, pumpkins. Pumpkins. No, the world did not know about pumpkins, right? So, what would Halloween have looked like if they did not know about pumpkins? I kid with that one, but just think about it. These are all of the things that the Europeans took with them to Europe, and just think about some of these things that European countries are very well associated with. So that movement of food is really something that's going to be super beneficial for Europe as a whole. And it's also super important to understand that food and crops do move from the Americas to Europe, to Africa, to Asia. But the same is also happening in the opposite direction. This is where we get into the idea that this is an exchange. We talked about disease. You know, syphilis moves from the Americas to Europe and spreads like wildfire. The Europeans obviously bring their disease. This is where we're getting into this idea that it is an exchange. Um, Horses, for one, were first domesticated in Central Asia about 6,000 years ago. So you're talking about like 4,000 BCE ish. From there, they're brought into Europe, right? We've talked about the domestication of the horse, the domestication of the camels and whatnot. So animals are domesticated. But it's Spanish conquistadors that bring horses to the Americas, and horses become an important part of Native American culture. And in fact, today, if you think about um, Texas, right, the cowboy, if you will, although not the Dallas Cowboys, um, but the cowboy culture, the vaquero culture, none of that would have existed if the Spanish wouldn't have brought horses with them, right? Livestock, so cattle, and again, burgers, cows, right? Texas is super well known for cows, and we'll talk about cows a lot more as we go. But livestock for meat was another important introduction to the Americas. Argentina is now really famous for its beef. But prior to the Columbian exchange, there were no horses here. There were no cows here. Those did not exist. Sugarcane, which is grown a lot here in the valley, in the Rio Grande Valley, was a very important crop to focus on because it becomes a cash crop, a crop that is used to make money. So we have plantations that are established to grow that crop with the use of slave labor. And we'll talk more about the importation of people a bit later. But sugarcane did not exist here. Coffee beans, right? Today, Colombia, known for a lot of things, but really well known for its coffee, right? Colombian coffee. Coffee did not exist here before this Columbian exchange. Wheat did not exist here Rice, I know you guys love to hear about champa rice. Rice did not exist here in the Americas before that. Oats, right? If you had oatmeal this morning, it did not exist in the Americas before the Europeans brought it. Bananas, right? Bananas super grown in like South America, Central America. We fought banana wars in the 1900s, like 1911 ish. Those don't exist here before the Columbian exchange, before the Europeans bring them. So again, just kind of keep these ideas and these things in mind. What goes to Europe? What do the Europeans bring here? This is the exchange that we want to focus on. So in your notes, you've got a couple of questions to really think about and answer, but here's the effect of that exchange of food. And here, particularly, we are looking um, specifically, what is the effect on Europe because of this exchange of food? Well, in the period between 1500 and 1750, so in this period that we're discussing now, the population of Europe doubles from around 65 million people in 1500 to by the end of 1750, you're looking at a population of 127 million plus. Most of that growth occurs in the century between 1500 and 1600. So, what I want you to think about and what I want you to answer on your notes is what do you think is the number one cause of that population boom in Europe? Okay, well, I'll have you pause this video in just a second to answer that question, and I'll tell you what that answer should be. But also, I also want you to think about how is this similar or different to the population growth that Song China experienced? Because again, you love champa rice. So Song China experienced similar growth when it got champa rice. Why? So pause the video here, jot down some answers, and then in just a second, I'll give you the answer. Okay, so for question number one, what do you think was the number one cause of the population boom in Europe? The simple answer is you're bringing in this wide variety of foods, right? The potato, the tomato, vegetables of all kinds that didn't exist in Europe. Um, so this importation of a wide variety of new foods, these foods become staples, right? The potato is a staple product. The tomato becomes a staple food product. And so this really helps improve the supply of food in Europe, right? Um, so, again, we've sort of talked about this before: more food, more people. Here, we're also talking about more nutritious food. Europe did not have the best food before this. So these foods are more nutritious. So people live longer. They're living longer. They're making more babies. They're having more kids, etc., and so on and so forth. So the wider variety of foods leads to that population increase. And then to answer the second question, just some of the things that we talked about with Song China, right? You should remember back to Unit 1, where we talked about that Song China experiences a population growth after an introduction of champa rice, which, again, champa rice was not necessarily more nutritious, but the benefits that it had was that it could be produced in greater volume and at a faster rate. The food that's coming back from the Americas is of a better variety. So it really improved the nutritional quality for Europe. So that's really what it caused a population boom, was the nutritional quality. But we're also getting a lot of it. So greater volume of food that is able to be produced at a faster rate. So any influx of food is often part of population growth because, again, like we've kind of boiled it down to, more food equals more people. Then, lastly, here, when we start talking about the movement of people to the Americas, because again, the Columbian exchange is the exchange of ideas, of food, of culture, um, and people. Now, the movement of people, this is not mostly exchange. Is there some examples of some individuals coming from the Americas to Europe? Yes, it did happen, but not in any large scale, right? So the transfer of people within the Columbian exchange is really one way. So you have European settlers who come to North and South America to live in these various colonies. And we've already talked about how Africa, there was a significant slave trade within Africa. So European countries would go to Africa, purchase slaves, and then once we started bringing them to the Americas, right? So you sort of create this triangular trade. The Europeans take finished products and things to Africa to exchange and buy people, enslaved people, and then take those people to the Americas. That's what we call the Middle Passage, and then take the raw materials that they're extracting from the Americas, they take those back to Europe and start that process over again. So, slave labor from Africa brings a huge influx of people. Those people, of course, bring their culture. You have about 12 million enslaved Africans that are brought to the New World between 1540 and 1860. Half of those 12 million, so right around 6 million, end up actually going to Brazil. But again, large populations of enslaved labor throughout the rest of the Americas as well. So we'll definitely discuss that in more detail. And we do that by talking about cash crops. So cash crops are crops that are produced for their commercial value rather than for use by the farmer. Now, it isn't to say that a farmer isn't going to use any of the crop for themselves, but typically speaking, they are growing to sell, right? It's a commercialization of farming. Portugal had really discovered how valuable it was to grow sugar as a cash crop. Um, and they discovered that well before the Columbian exchange began. So if we think about the last topic, Portugal had discovered this uninhabited island. They colonized it, the island of Madeira. They turned it into this really highly profitable sugar producing colony early on in the 1400s. And it's harvesting sugarcane, right? So that's very labor intensive. So Portugal takes a lot of work. So Portugal has to also have a supply of labor to not only grow but to cut, to process, etc. the sugarcane. And they use African slaves. African slaves are brought to Madeira to work the sugarcane farms, and by the end of the 15th century, Madeira was the world's largest. This small island off the coast of Africa is the world's largest producer of sugar, right? And so this model of sugarcane production in Madeira is something that then is applied in Brazil, in the West Indies. And this is after the Portuguese and the Spanish begin setting up colonies in the Americas. So sugarcane is brought to Brazil and the West Indies from Europe. African slaves are then brought in to work in those highly lucrative sugar farms to make money for the people growing it, not for themselves, right? Um, and Madeira then loses its status as the leader of sugar production when Brazil comes online, and Brazil actually becomes the center of sugar production during this during this era of the Columbian exchange. So just keep that in mind. Sugar is considered to be like white gold, right? That is how valuable it was for both Portugal and then later Spain to find places to grow it. So the sugar mills, this sugar production in Brazil is really a good example of that triangular trade we were talking about just a little bit ago. In addition to the general transfer of goods, disease, and people between the old world and the new world, there is a particular pattern that comes around, and we just discussed a bit ago. Enslaved Africans come to the Americas, the raw materials and the cash crops, the sugar, the tobacco, etc., go from the Americas to Europe. Europe then manufactures products with those materials, whether it be things with sugar and whatnot, or with tobacco, cigars, and cigarettes, and things like that. And then those finished goods are then taken to Africa and sold in Africa. So there's this need for this continuous importation of slave labor for a couple of reasons. One, um, it's a very dangerous journey for the Africans. They're enslaved and they're imprisoned basically. So they're not very well taken care of. A lot of them die on this trip. And then they're given work that is very dangerous, right? And they're working in these mills and these plantations, and the kind of work that they're doing is like so strenuous. Um, it's not regulated in any sort of way. So it's really common for enslaved Africans to die within 10 years of being brought to work in the Americas. So again, just imagine these are people who are ripped out of their communities by African um, societies in African countries, African states, and then sold off to the Europeans. And then the Europeans then rip them off the continent of Africa and take them to the Americas, a place they've never known. And then they're put to work, they're forced to work, they're sold off. And then, right, the work that they do is so dangerous, they most likely will die within the decade, within 10 years. So these African workers are then thought to be or viewed as disposable labor, right? In a lot of cases. So, and of course, that's not a sentiment that we share mostly today, but in this period, that is how they're viewed. That they were, it was essentially a commodity. It was as if you were purchasing, say, a horse. You purchased the horse to do the job. If the horse died, well, I'll just get another horse, right, or another camel, for example. Um, it was in that there was no love lost for that. So really want to emphasize to you that this triangular trade refers more than just to Brazil, more than just to sugar. This is just one example that we can use to paint this picture to show you this triangular trade. It exists in a lot more forms than this. So again, just to reiterate, the transatlantic slave trade, which is something that we also call the Middle Passage, it is one part of the triangle, if you will. So the vast majority of slaves that are sold via the transatlantic slave trade come from Central and West Africa. Most are sold to European traders by those in the West African kingdoms. Um, and again, remember what we've talked about so far up until now with slavery. Slavery existed in Africa, right? The people who were captured to be slaves and then later found themselves being sold off to the Europeans were either prisoners of war or people who owed some form of debt or had committed some form of crime. Slavery in Africa was not race based. There was no race based slavery. It wasn't as if, this color African American, or excuse me, this color African is enslaving this color African. That did not exist in this period. It's not until the Europeans come in and they are taking these slaves, these enslaved peoples from Africa, that it then really does become about enslaved African labor. It becomes a racial component. So we'll talk more about that as we go. But the Portuguese are really the only Europeans that really frequently engage in slave raids in Africa. Portugal has a really strong presence in Africa all the way up until the 1860s. And again, we talked about 12 million enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas by way of this Middle Passage during that time. So between the 1490s and 1860, you have over 12 million people who were brought to the Americas. Brazil, again, being the biggest receiver of Africans during that period. And this will have lasting effects in this community. So, what is the lasting effects of the slave trade? And it brings back a word that we have talked about before, and that is diaspora. So, if you haven't remembered or recalled that word, you may want to jot it down here. What is a diaspora? A diaspora is a population that is scattered across different regions and is separate from its geographic place of origin. So here we see the creation of an African diaspora, right? The slave trade permanently changes the social landscape of the Americas. Um, these enslaved Africans create this they bring their culture with them, right? They're not leaving their culture in Africa, so they bring themselves with them, um, their culture. And so this creates an African diaspora. So Brazil's population, for example, today is incredibly diverse. And you have, 50 to 60% of the population of the country that claims some form of African heritage. This African diaspora creates new languages, new music styles, introduce new foods to North and South America, things like gumbo, Creole cooking. Creole is still super popular. Well, I shouldn't say popular, super prevalent in places like in and around Louisiana, Mississippi, um, prevalent all across the Caribbean. Um, it's also you have like the Low Country in South Carolina, the Gullah people. In fact, there used to be a show when I was a kid called Gullah Gullah Island. It was about a group of people who were Gullah people. The Gullah were from Africa. Um, that was just representation on like Saturday morning shows. It was on Nickelodeon, by the way. So if you ever want to look it up, but it was this bringing around African heritage. So new languages, new music styles, new foods, those things. So we're familiar with diaspora, um, much in the same way as, like, for example, a lot of people who move from the valley out of the valley to go to college, right? They kind of create their little communities when they go to college. You might experience that when you go to college, but they take that culture, that their way of being, with them. That's sort of very small scale and very simplified, but this like 956 version of things. Um, and Mexican food, right? There's a Mexican diaspora in lots of different places. There's people in the UK who are of Mexican heritage and Mexican descent, and there are some pretty great Mexican restaurants and things like that in London, for example. So this is a diaspora. We should be familiar by this point with diaspora. We've talked about diaspora before in other contexts, and it's certainly a long-lasting effect from the slave trade here. So it's important to reiterate again. All right. So this last slide here is a primary source. It is a map of North America in 1730. And what I want you to do here is I really want you to look at this map. So I'll give you some time here to pause and look at this map. But what elements do you see from the Columbian Exchange that are present on this map? So I'll give you just a bit. You can pause. You can glance at this map, and then we'll chat about it in a sec. So, what you should see, right, is we do see examples of what look to be enslaved peoples working to bring harvested crops and raw materials up a hill. Um, this really shows the exchange of people as well as crops and raw materials. You might see some horses and some livestock on the map itself, some cattle on the map itself. Remember, horses and cows and things like that don't exist in North America before the Columbian Exchange. So keep an eye out for these things as we look at primary sources. But that mostly wraps up this unit. So these are the ideas for you to review, right? What does the Columbian Exchange refer to? It's the exchange of goods, ideas, disease, and people between the two hemispheres, mostly dominated by Spain and Portugal. Disease sort of lopsidedly spreads from Europeans to the people in the Americas who have no immunity, which kills roughly half of the population. And then remember that 80 to 90% of total population died as a result of European contact. So again, 50% from disease, the other 30 to 40% from some sort of other issue, whether that be famine, whether that be war, etc. Um, Food and livestock change diets in both hemispheres, right? You bring cows, people start eating meat, proteins. Enslaved people are brought to the Americas through the Middle Passage, and then that slave trade results in the transfer of African culture or the creation of an African diaspora in the Americas. So that will wrap up 4.3, and I will see you for our next lecture.